I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been recovering from surgery.
When Queen Camilla leaned down to speak to Prince George, she didn't realize Catherine was nearby. But the way her son's eyes dropped, the way his shoulders stiffened, Catherine didn't need to hear the words to know something was wrong. And what followed next would change everything. It was supposed to be a typical spring afternoon at Kensington. Formal, well-orchestrated, and quietly exhausting. A joint royal engagement had brought together senior family members to honor a new education initiative supported by the king. Just another ribbon cutting for the public, just another high-pressure family gathering behind palace gates. But something about this particular event felt off to Catherine from the start. Maybe it was the way George hesitated at the breakfast table that morning, barely touching his eggs. Or maybe it was that distant look in his eyes, like he was already bracing for something. He wasn't sulking. He wasn't nervous. It was something else. He'd always been confident in public. Thoughtful, but warm. But that day, it was as if he was trying to shrink himself. And for a boy raised to stand tall beside a future king, that shift didn't go unnoticed by his mother. The palace had arranged for the children to attend part of the afternoon reception. Nothing too official. A brief appearance, smiles, photos, then back to their studies. Catherine had dressed George herself, straightened his collar, kissed his cheek, and sent him out with the others. But less than an hour later, she spotted him again, standing stiffly near the west corridor, eyes fixed on the floor, lips pressed together in a tight line. No tears, just quiet humiliation. Catherine walked toward him, slow but certain. Something had happened, and someone was going to answer for it. It had all been carefully planned, as these things always were. The afternoon reception was being held at St. James's Palace, tucked behind polished gates and lined with white-gloved staff who seemed to appear and disappear like clockwork. The event itself was meant to highlight the king's ongoing efforts in educational outreach, particularly among underserved youth. Officially, it was about charity. Unofficially, it was about unity. Behind closed doors, these kinds of gatherings had become a delicate dance, a balancing act between tradition and personality, title and temperament. Charles had insisted on including the children just for a short time. "Let them be seen," he'd said. "It's important they understand the weight of this work." Catherine hadn't objected. George, Charlotte, and Louis had all been coached on public appearances for years. Still, she preferred to keep their involvement brief and tightly supervised. Camilla, of course, was present, seated at the head table in a pale blue coat dress, flanked by long-standing aides and her own set of loyal companions. She smiled when appropriate, laughed softly at light jokes, and kept her comments clipped but audible, always aware of who was listening. That was her way. The main hall had been staged to perfection. Fresh-cut tulips, crystal glasses filled with elderflower pressé, and rows of chairs positioned just so. The adults gathered in clusters, exchanging pleasantries, while the children were quietly ushered to a smaller antechamber at the side of the main reception. It was a common practice. Allow the younger royals a brief roll, then pull them back before the room's temperature changed. George had been asked to join a short round table with two other young heirs from European royal families. Nothing heavy, just a show of kinship. A few questions, a photo op, then back to the drawing room for lemonade and biscuits. Catherine had watched from the doorway at first, smiling as George answered a question about his favorite school subject, history, of course. His voice had been steady, his eyes bright, but when Camilla entered the room a few minutes later, something shifted. It was subtle, just a glance, a brief tightening of his posture. She noticed it, filed it away. These moments weren't unfamiliar. Over the years, Catherine had learned to track the emotional temperature of a room in seconds. It came with being both a mother and a royal, a dual identity that left very little room for error. William could afford to be affable, to assume the best, but she had to watch, she had to be sure. Outside the children's room, Catherine made her way through the reception, speaking with school leaders, donors, and ministers. Her smile didn't falter, but her mind was still partly with George. She had seen too many small things add up before. Phrases disguised as advice, comments passed off as light-hearted correction. Camilla had a particular talent for those. Catherine wasn't looking for trouble, she never was, but something in her gut told her to stay close, just in case. She wasn't prepared, though, for what came next. It was about 20 minutes later when she spotted George again, no longer with the other children, no longer engaged. He was alone, standing near a column just outside the music room, his hands tucked in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't see her at first, but she saw him. And when she followed the path he'd come from, when she stepped quietly toward the archway and caught a glimpse of Camilla walking the other direction, composed, unfazed, sipping from a glass of water, she knew something had happened in that room, and she was going to find out what it was. George had never been the type to sulk. Even as a toddler, he carried himself with an ease that made people underestimate how much he actually noticed. Polite, composed, observant. He took everything in, even when he didn't say much. But that morning, Catherine had seen the first flickers of something unfamiliar. It started at breakfast. Usually, George would chat about his latest school project or the football scores from the weekend. He'd ask William about upcoming events or tease Charlotte for stealing the last bit of honey from the table. But not that day. He'd eaten quietly, barely touching his toast, his fingers tapping gently against the edge of his plate like he was somewhere else entirely. When Catherine had asked if something was wrong, he had simply shrugged. "Just tired," he'd said, but the words felt like a placeholder. It wasn't until the car ride to St. James's that she noticed the deeper silence. Charlotte and Louis were going over a silly rhyme they'd learned from their nanny, repeating it in exaggerated voices, laughing and making faces. George, usually the first to join in, kept his gaze out the window, watching the streets blur past. Catherine didn't press. She knew better than to corner him with too many questions, but a mother knows. She sees things others miss, and by the time they'd arrived at the palace, the change in his demeanor had only grown sharper. He held himself differently, rigid, overly formal. Not nervous exactly, but guarded. When the children were brought into the smaller reception room, Catherine lingered in the hallway just long enough to watch him interact with the others. He smiled when spoken to. He answered questions when prompted, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he was trying too hard not to get something wrong. She caught it in the small things, how he looked to the adults before speaking, how he stayed seated even when the other children stood to stretch or move around, how he kept glancing toward the door as if hoping someone would come back in. That wasn't George. That wasn't how he behaved when he was at ease. And then, after the segment ended and the children were meant to rejoin the adults briefly, George had slipped away. No one seemed to notice at first. Too many things happening at once, but Catherine did. She saw him walking through the corridor outside the music room. His steps were slow, deliberate, his face was blank, and when she reached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, he barely looked up. That was when the quiet alarm in her chest turned into something sharper. He wasn't just quiet, he wasn't just tired. He was holding something in, and she was about to find out what. The room was warm with afternoon sun when Catherine entered it, but something about the air felt colder than it should have been. She had doubled back quietly, telling a nearby staffer she needed a moment to check on the children. No one questioned it. Catherine had a reputation for being hands-on with her kids, even when surrounded by courtiers and cameras. No one thought twice as she slipped down the eastern corridor toward the music room, heels soft against the Persian rug. That's when she heard it. Camilla's voice wasn't loud. In fact, it was almost too casual, measured and calm in that particular tone she used when trying to sound helpful, but couldn't quite hide the edge behind her words. "George, love," she was saying, "we must remember that not every moment is about us. There's a time for children to shine, and a time to sit quietly." Catherine froze, just outside the half-open door. George's voice followed, hesitant. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought it was all right to answer. Mr. Ellis asked us what we do to help our schools, and I—" Camilla interrupted before he could finish. "And I'm sure your answer was very sweet, darling, but sometimes it's better to let the grown-ups steer the conversation." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. Catherine stepped forward slowly and glanced inside. George stood near the piano bench, his hands folded in front of him. Camilla was standing a few feet away, sipping from a glass of water, her posture easy, but her tone unmistakably patronizing. There was a faint smile on her face, the kind people give when they're trying to make a point without raising their voice. "I just didn't want to seem rude," George said quietly. Camilla laughed, just once. "Well, you wouldn't want people to think you're showing off. There's nothing worse than arrogance in a young boy." That was enough. Catherine stepped through the doorway, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak at first. Camilla turned her head, clearly startled, her smile faltering as their eyes met. "There you are," Catherine said, her voice even. George looked up, visibly relieved at the sight of his mother. "We were just having a little chat," Camilla offered lightly. "I heard," Catherine replied. She walked over to George, placing a steady hand on his back. He leaned slightly into her, instinctively. Camilla didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "He was only answering a question," she said, "but these things require a bit of restraint. It's easy to let young boys get carried away." Catherine didn't blink. He was asked for his thoughts. He gave them. "That's not something I discourage." Camilla raised an eyebrow, shifting slightly. "Of course, but confidence can be mistaken for something else if it's not tempered." George looked down again, his shoulders tense. Catherine noticed. She crouched next to him, her tone softening as she spoke directly to her son. "Did you feel like you did something wrong, sweetheart?" George hesitated, then nodded, just barely. Catherine stood. Her face was calm, but the energy in the room had shifted. Sharply, "I'd prefer it if no one corrected my child, unless something truly inappropriate was said," she said plainly, which I doubt was the case. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For once, she had no quick reply. Catherine gave her a polite, unflinching nod. "Excuse us." And with that, she led George out of the room, her hand firm on his back, steadying him as they walked. They didn't speak until they turned the corner, away from the others, out of earshot. Then Catherine stopped, crouched again, and looked into his eyes. "You did nothing wrong," she said quietly. "Do you understand me?" George nodded again, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "She said I talked too much." Catherine inhaled deeply, holding back the sharpness that rose in her throat. "And I say you were brave. You spoke kindly and clearly. That's what matters." He didn't respond, but he held her gaze this time. And in that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. This wouldn't be buried. Not like the other moments. Not like the quiet digs and sideways glances over the years. Not when it involved her child. Back in the main corridor, the sounds of clinking glasses and polite laughter filtered through the halls. But for Catherine, the world had narrowed down to just one thing: her son's silence. George walked beside her without a word. His hands were still tucked in front of him, and though he wasn't crying, his eyes had that unmistakable glazed look, like he was replaying something in his mind and trying to make sense of it. Catherine didn't rush. She didn't fill the space with soft distractions or try to cheer him up. Instead, she led him toward a small drawing room on the far side of the palace. It was mostly unused during events like this, quiet, sunlit, and away from the crowd. When they stepped inside, she closed the door behind them and guided George to the velvet settee in front of the window. He sat, looking out at the gardens, and she sat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Catherine leaned in slightly and said, "Would you like to tell me what happened?" George's voice was small. "I said something in the meeting room about how I'd help schools if I were king someday." He paused, then added, "Everyone laughed. I think they liked it." "I'm sure they did," Catherine said gently. He hesitated. "But then, Granny Camilla pulled me aside after. She said I was making too much of it, that people don't like children who act like they know everything." Catherine's jaw tensed, but her expression stayed soft. "I told her I didn't mean it like that," he went on. "She said I need to be careful how I come across, that no one likes arrogance." He said the last word like it stung to repeat it. "She said that to you?" Catherine asked. George nodded. Catherine took a breath, pressing her hand over his. "You weren't arrogant, George. You were thoughtful. You answered a question with heart, and that's exactly what good leaders do." He looked at her, and she saw the confusion still swimming in his eyes. "She doesn't get to make you feel small," Catherine continued, "and if she ever says something again that makes you uncomfortable, I want you to tell me. Every time, okay?" George nodded, more firmly this time. Outside the window, a pair of photographers were setting up behind the trellis for the next staged photo call. Inside the room, Catherine sat straighter, her hand still resting lightly on her son's. She'd tolerated Camilla's casual barbs over the years, the sideways remarks, the outdated ideas about how children, especially heirs, should behave. But this wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was about dignity, about her son's right to speak and be heard. And as far as Catherine was concerned, that line had now been crossed. The reception ended without incident, at least none that anyone else noticed. Photos were taken, smiles were worn, speeches were delivered in polished tones. The royal machine rolled on, unbothered by the quiet unraveling happening just beneath the surface. Catherine didn't speak much during the car ride home. The children were chatty again, Charlotte singing softly under her breath, Louis clutching a toy knight from one of the display tables. George remained quiet, but not withdrawn. Still thinking, perhaps, processing. She didn't push him. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had gone still, Catherine walked into the study where William was reviewing briefing notes for an upcoming trip. He looked up when she entered, sensing her mood immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked, setting the folder down. "No," she said simply. She sat opposite him in the leather armchair, not bothering to ease into the conversation. "It happened again," she said, "with George." William straightened slightly. "What do you mean?" Catherine looked at him directly. "Camilla pulled him aside after the youth roundtable, told him he was being arrogant, that no one likes a child who talks too much." He blinked, stunned into silence. Catherine's voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. She said it in that calm, quiet way she does, like it was her place. William exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. "Did he tell you this?" "I heard it. I walked in as she was finishing." She paused. "And he confirmed it afterward. He thought he'd done something wrong. He felt ashamed." William's jaw tightened. "That's not okay." "No," Catherine said. "It isn't, and it isn't the first time either." She didn't need to remind him. They both knew the pattern. Small remarks made in passing, always wrapped in civility, always said just quietly enough to deny intent. "She's careful," Catherine said. "Always has been. But she's never been careful with them. Not with the children, and I've let it go too many times." William nodded, his expression clouded now. "Do you want me to speak to her?" "No," she said quickly. "Not yet. Not unless it happens again." He looked surprised. "I want her to know I saw it," Catherine continued. "I want her to understand that I'm not ignoring it anymore, that the line's been drawn." William leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "And if she crosses it again?" Catherine didn't blink. "She won't." There was no threat in her voice, just certainty. A quiet finality that made clear she wasn't asking for approval or support. She was informing him of a decision. William nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "then we watch." Catherine stood, smoothed the front of her sweater, and headed toward the hallway. George was asleep by the time she peeked in on him, one arm tucked under the pillow, his brow no longer furrowed. She whispered goodnight, closed the door gently, and walked away with a calm she had earned the hard way. She had spent years learning how to carry herself through palace politics. Now she was learning how to push back. The invitation had come the way most royal invites did, through a formal call from one of Charles's senior aides, praised politely but firmly. A quiet dinner at Highgrove, just the inner circle. Time to catch up, reconnect, and review the family's upcoming engagements. Catherine had no reason to decline. On paper, it sounded harmless, but something about it made her uneasy. Still, she went. The house was dimly lit that evening, bathed in golden light from the chandeliers and fireplace. The atmosphere was relaxed, at least by royal standards, soft jazz playing through the parlor speakers, drinks offered on silver trays. Catherine arrived with William and George. Charlotte and Louis had stayed home with the nanny, but George had asked to come. He wanted to say goodnight to his grandfather. It was a simple gesture, one Catherine had supported. They were barely 15 minutes into the evening when it happened. George had just entered the lounge with Catherine. He was freshly dressed, hair combed neatly, hands clasped behind his back. In that way he'd learned from mimicking William. "Good evening, Grandpa," he said, standing tall. Charles beamed. "There's my boy," he said warmly, opening his arms. George stepped forward to hug him. Catherine lingered near the doorway, watching with a faint smile. Then Camilla, seated by the fire with a glass of wine in hand, looked up. Her voice was casual, almost breezy. "Are you sure you're not too tired to be here, darling?" The words hung in the air. George paused mid-step. His smile faded just slightly. Catherine saw it. Everyone did. It wasn't what Camilla said. It was how she said it. The lift of her eyebrow, the undercurrent of judgment masked as concern. The way her tone suggested not worry, but criticism. The implication? "You don't belong here right now." George didn't respond. He simply glanced back at his mother. Catherine's polite expression fell away. She walked calmly across the room, her steps slow, deliberate. She placed a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "Why don't you say goodnight to Grandpa?" she said, her voice smooth but firm, "and then go upstairs with Anna." George nodded quickly. He hugged Charles again, then turned and walked quietly out of the room with the family nanny. As the door clicked shut, silence took its place. Camilla sipped her wine, then muttered lightly, "Well, he's very sensitive, isn't he?" William froze. Charles looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. A few aides exchanged glances, but Catherine didn't look away. She stepped forward, every word chosen with care. "No," she said, voice level. "He's not too sensitive. He's a child, and he deserves to be spoken to with kindness." Camilla blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't mean it that way. I was just surprised he's still up at this hour. It's not something to get upset over." Catherine didn't move. "It wasn't just tonight." Camilla tilted her head defensively. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's been building," Catherine replied. "The comments, the tone, the corrections disguised as advice." William stayed quiet beside her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Charles opened his mouth as if to soften the moment. "Perhaps we all need to—" "No," Catherine said, cutting in gently but firmly. "This isn't about one remark. This is about a pattern, and I won't stand by while my son is made to feel small." Camilla looked at William, searching for backup. But William's face remained unreadable. Catherine's voice lowered now, but the clarity only sharpened it. "I've overlooked things for years, for peace, for appearances. But this is different. George isn't a symbol. He's a boy, and if anyone makes him feel less than, I will step in. Every time." Camilla set her glass down with more force than necessary. "You're reading too much into this," she said, her voice clipped. "You always take things so personally. Children are resilient. He'll be fine." Catherine's eyes didn't waver. Resilience isn't an excuse for unkindness. A long silence followed. Charles shifted again, but didn't speak. The aides stayed frozen in place, knowing better than to interrupt. Catherine looked down briefly, collecting herself, then back at Camilla. "Going forward," she said softly, "I expect George to be treated with respect. Not caution, not distance, just respect." Camilla stared back, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Catherine didn't wait for a response. She turned and exited the room, her composure intact, her silence echoing louder than any speech. William followed moments later, and the room, once filled with idle chatter and the sounds of clinking crystal, felt suddenly too quiet. By the time they returned to Adelaide Cottage, the children were asleep, the staff had turned down the lights, and the house was quiet. But Catherine wasn't. She moved through the rooms with a focus that William recognized instantly. Not anger, but certainty. A decision had been made. And when Catherine made up her mind about something involving the children, she didn't move backward. She stopped in George's room before changing out of her evening clothes. He was sleeping soundly, a slight furrow still lingering in his brow, even in sleep. She smoothed the blanket across his chest, brushing a hand through his hair. He hadn't said much after the dinner. He didn't need to. He had seen everything in her expression. The next morning, Catherine made a call to the palace office. George would not be attending the upcoming Youth Environmental Showcase, an event organized in part by Camilla's team. Catherine told the staff he had a slight cough and needed rest. Technically true, his throat had been scratchy the day before, but that wasn't why she was keeping him home. She didn't want him anywhere near another polite correction masquerading as mentorship. She didn't want him forced to shrink himself to preserve someone else's comfort. Word traveled quickly, as it always did. By afternoon, one of Camilla's aides had quietly inquired, off the record, whether George's absence was personal or political. Catherine gave no clarification. Later that evening, while preparing for a separate engagement, she overheard a passing comment from one of the household staff. Her Majesty said perhaps Prince George is a bit delicate for outdoor events. Catherine didn't respond. Not then. She simply nodded, thanked them, and moved on with her schedule. But her silence wasn't acquiescence, it was a boundary, one she had drawn without raising her voice. It didn't go unnoticed. In the days that followed, the energy around the royal corridors changed, subtle but undeniable. Staffers became more cautious, briefings were double-checked, conversations paused when Catherine entered the room. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't written memos or called for meetings, but the message had been received. William, for his part, stayed mostly quiet publicly, but Catherine knew where he stood. His silence that evening at Highgrove hadn't been passivity. It had been strategy, letting her lead, letting her be heard without interruption. When they spoke about it again late one evening, William simply said, "You were right to say it." Catherine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The real victory wasn't in Camilla's reaction, it was in George's. He stood taller the next morning, said more at breakfast, laughed a little louder with Charlotte. That was the win. That was the line that mattered. Catherine had learned over the years that palace life demanded compromise, that dignity sometimes meant swallowing your pride in silence. But motherhood? Motherhood demanded something else entirely. It demanded that you protect what is still forming, what is still soft, what is still becoming. And now, the institution knew Catherine wasn't protecting her image, she was protecting her son. Balmoral had always been Charles's favorite place. Miles from the scrutiny of London, where the air was cold, the pine trees stood tall, and the traditions felt older than the crown itself. The royal family gathered every summer like clockwork to walk the hills, play outdoor games, and pretend, at least for a little while, that they were just another family. This summer was no different on paper, but beneath the tartan and the picnic baskets, something had changed. Catherine had agreed to come, but she'd come with a condition. George would not be left alone, not even for 5 minutes. They arrived in staggered waves, William and Catherine first, with the children, greeted warmly by Charles. Camilla arrived 2 days later, surrounded by staff and carefully wrapped in tweed and pearls. Her smile was gracious, her tone was cordial, but there had been no direct contact between her and Catherine since the dinner at Highgrove. They exchanged brief hellos, nothing more. The days passed without incident. George seemed lighter, climbing trees, laughing with his siblings, asking questions about local wildlife. Catherine had begun to let herself breathe again, but it didn't last. It happened on the 5th afternoon. William and Charles had gone fishing. Catherine was in the drawing room, reviewing correspondence with Lady Sarah Chatto and a private secretary. The children had been playing in the garden, watched over by 2 staff members. Then came the whisper. "I believe Prince George is in the sunroom with Her Majesty," one of the footmen said casually. Catherine's spine straightened. She didn't speak. She stood up, nodded, and walked out, her steps quick and silent. She reached the sunroom door and paused. Inside, she heard Camilla's voice. "George, I know it's tempting to speak your mind, but you'll need to learn that not everyone is interested in what you think. That's just how it is." A pause. "I'm only trying to help. Sometimes your mother forgets what's appropriate for future kings." Catherine opened the door. The air in the room shifted instantly. Camilla turned halfway through her sentence. "Oh, Catherine, I didn't realize. I was looking for George," Catherine said, her tone flat. George stood by the window, face turned down. "You found him," Camilla said lightly. "I did." She walked straight to George and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Darling, would you mind checking on Louis and Charlotte for me?" George nodded and left without a word. As the door shut behind him, Catherine turned. "Let's be very clear," she said, her voice low but direct. "You may not agree with how I raise my son, but you do not speak to him about what I forget. Not ever." Camilla's face tightened. "It wasn't meant to be criticism." "It was," Catherine cut in, "and it's over." For a moment, neither of them moved. "I expect kindness. That's all I've ever asked," Catherine added. "And if that's too much, then distance will do just as well." She didn't wait for a reply. The door closed softly behind her, and from that moment on, the space between them became permanent. By the end of the summer, things looked unchanged to the outside world. Family photos were released, smiling faces on the Balmoral steps, a sea of coordinated jackets, polite waves to the cameras. The tabloids gushed over the Queen's classic countryside charm. Royal watchers commented on Catherine's outfit. Everything, outwardly, was in order. But inside the walls of Balmoral, a shift had occurred. Camilla remained present, of course. She still laughed during meals, still led discussions about garden projects and community outreach. But she no longer offered unsolicited advice. She no longer corrected. And most notably, she kept her distance from George. There were no more private chats, no more offhand remarks. And Catherine didn't need an apology. She didn't expect one. She had never been in this life to win approval. That night, back at Adelaide Cottage, George knocked softly on her bedroom door. She was reading in bed. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Always," she said. He climbed up beside her, leaning against her arm. "I didn't say anything wrong, did I?" he asked quietly. "No," she whispered. "Not even a little." He nodded slowly. "You stood up for me." She smiled, kissing the top of his head. "I always will." And that was it. No grand pronouncements, no tabloid leaks, no dramatic fallout. But in a world governed by centuries of protocol, something rare had happened. A mother had drawn a boundary, not for herself, but for her child. And even in a family built on tradition, that boundary would hold. Because Catherine had made one thing unshakably clear. She was raising a future king. But more importantly, she was raising a boy who would never have to doubt his worth.